of the zone. It resonates in your house. After the sound and our applause, we build you till nothing remains. The air cracks as the true truth will gather out of you.
Control is a game that I picked up for completely all the wrong reasons. I'd only caught glimpses of it in passing previously, and disregarded it as looking a bit like the kind of modern day take on a game that would be released circa the PlayStation 2 era. It only happened by chance that it came bundled with a new graphics card purchase, along with being touted to have an impressive use of ray tracing. My install of the game was primarily for tech demo purposes, but after about 20 minutes the ray tracing got turned off to prioritise performance, and a further 20 hours of gameplay later, here we are. Control is the latest game developed by Remedy, whose previous outings include Quantum Break, Alan Wake, and more importantly the first two Max Payne games.
I get my hopes up. So many times it's led to nothing.
Fitting with their back catalogue, the original face of Max Payne himself, Sam Lake, takes helm of the narrative, which starts off by introducing us to our main protagonist, Jesse. Starting a game for the first time will deliver a theme-setting level of convoluted exposition as Jesse narrates the opening cinematic. Unclear as to whether she is addressing us the player or an unknown character, she explains her arrival at the Federal Bureau for Control to be at the request of the narrative recipient. The first line of dialogue spoken in the game is,
"This is gonna be weirder than usual."
and the proceeding monologue only builds on that with themes of entrapment, conspiracy, and imagery of intriguing characters and objects like janitors, upside-down pyramids, and a menacing-looking nutter. The opening is short, only taking a few moments to give vague reason to your character's arrival, and the game starts immediately by handing over control, no pun intended, of Jesse. This is a third-person action game, which will only take a few minutes to allow you to get your bearings of the controls and camera. The first thing you'll probably notice is that the style of the game seems to be set in the 1980s with old-fashioned big monitors, big typewriters, paperwork and wooden panelling taking up real estate at the Bureau. After engaging with the on-site janitor, he will instruct us to take the elevator down should we be heading for the interview as his assistant. Following his instructions, we are treated to a very 90s thriller movie set of opening titles before the lift doors open, kicking off the gameplay properly with the title displayed boldly on the screen.
Did I lose you there for a moment? You know what's on my mind. My baby brother, Dylan.
The Bureau is barren at first, with only one main objective forcing our hand to go and visit the director. Upon reaching him, however, he has reached an unfortunate demise, and after some purposefully unintelligible instructions from the board, we don the murder weapon into the astral plane for a basic tutorial. This visually confirms the hinted at weirdness to the game and acts as your first lick of combat, which is what we have come to expect from a third-person shooter. The left mouse button fires your weapon, and holding the right mouse button will zoom in and increase accuracy at the cost of movement speed. Accompanying the basics of shooting things in the face, we can also sprint whilst holding shift and jump with the spacebar. Ammo for your service weapon is infinite, however, you'll have to wait a short amount of time for it to recharge, which will be even longer if you have completely expended a full clip. Conversely, health in Control does not regenerate. Instead, we have the welcome reprise of the health meter, which is refilled as you kill enemies by collecting small shards of blue light. After a brief shooting gallery, the plot slowly ravels tighter, as we are treated to an odd blend of Jesse and the real-life character actor Courtney Hope, brought on by the presence of gravity-defying entities. This soon turns into the kind of encounter the tutorial prepared us for, and from here on out we are thrown fully into the game's Metroidvania reminiscent semi-open world. It's a bit of a difficult game to try and commit a review of to paper, as it doesn't present itself in ways that are easy to talk about in chronological retrospect, especially once you have reached the ending. What I mean by that is where most narratives would settle the plot, give you a very clear goal, and you experience events unfolding based around doing what is necessary to achieve it. Control does something quite clever by setting two completely unsynchronized yet important story-driven motives. The first of these is the story that drives the action and gameplay. You have arrived at the Bureau to find the old director dead by potential suicide, and it is up to you to take up his mantle. Quickly, you'll be introduced to an eerie mixture of 80s-inspired government offices and creepy psychedelic suspended characters, and shape-shifting building, of course. Traversing the halls of this giant infrastructure, you will encounter what we learn to be people possessed by the Hiss. The Hiss has run rampant throughout the halls and has to be contained before it spreads to the wider world. Jesse is immune to the Hiss's powers, and along our way we will find NPCs who have managed to circumvent possession by use of chest-mounted devices.
Emily Pope, Dr. Darling's assistant.
My turn. Should I lie?
Jesse Faden. I'm just visiting.
There are few key NPCs in the game, the main of which is Emily, played by Antonia Bernath, who I can't say I recognise, but she was born in England, so of course she's been in Holby City at some point. Emily's main purpose in the game is to fill you in on your plot points, assign you new missions, and report back findings to.
You were at Ground Zero as a child? It was one of the big ones, and before my time. And very classified. I can try to dig out some old files for you.
Your objectives in the game are varied, but mostly all serve the progressive purpose of exploring a new area and gathering new weapons, powers, and items. As the game starts to open up, you will discover control points which Jesse has the ability to cleanse, thereby taking control. This is a very familiar gameplay mechanic, effectively creating a safe area allowing for fast travelling, upgrading, and weapon building. New weapons in the game are acquirable when a certain amount of components are found to form the basis of a blueprint. You don't have to have the required amount of components to be able to create the new weapon in order to see it, but if you haven't collected at least one of each of the required parts, it won't appear in the menu. Weapon components are found throughout combat drops and deposit boxes scattered throughout the game. It won't be clear at first what any of them do, and without knowing which builds they feed into, looking at them in your inventory is kind of pointless. But you will find them at such a rate that it will have you going back to check if anything new is available on a regular basis. It won't take too long until you start to pad out your arsenal to accommodate for the variation in enemy types. The first new weapon you will probably assemble is Shatter, which shapeshifts your starting pistol into a shooter's best friend, the shotgun. Different weapons still adopt the recharging ammo, size and impact of the fire dictating how many shots can be executed before the clip is fully depleted. As you explore the environment and encounter new and interesting enemies, you will also collect bigger and better drops in form of mods. Mods drop completely at random and are a mixture of being personal stat boosts or weapon upgrades that apply either to any weapon or only certain weapon types, for example increasing the accuracy of the spin gun. Mods come quick and often, and can range from increasing the amount of health you can receive from pickups, to reducing the amount of energy required to perform actions, to just improving the firepower of a weapon. Each mod will have 5 levels to potentially drop out, the higher the level expectedly giving the greater bolster to the improvement that goes along with it. Unused mods can be broken down into points that can later be spent on upgrading weapons or generating a random mod at a set level. Along with combat, your majority of time spent playing Control will be through exploration. The bureau that you excavate is vast in scope, but expanded at such a pace that you'll never feel too overfaced by the areas of your map that you haven't yet uncovered. There are also restrictions on avenues you can venture down, with certain areas being locked out until you obtain an appropriate level access keycard. Along with this, the game splits out its areas into floors which can be accessed by riding the elevator, and each floor will come with its own set of missions, enemy types and variants in structure. As you uncover new areas and fight through the Hiss infected, you will come across objects of power. These are bizarre anomalies that at first look like a puzzle or boss fight, but upon closer inspection are intriguingly mundane items that Jessie can cleanse, gaining her a new power. It will come as no spoiler to learn that mind control will play a big part of the combat along with other abilities you get along the way. Pretty much every environmental item you see in the game can be picked up and launched at an enemy full pelt to pleasing effect, and should nothing present itself as an obvious item worthy of acquainting with an enemy's face, then you can just pull a massive chunk of mortar out the wall and have at it. Lifting and launching comes at the cost of recharging your power meter, and similar to your weapons you will have to wait a short amount of time for it to recharge before you can continue to use it. It becomes pretty natural to perform a conscious juggle between weapons and launching, to continuously be inflicting pain without letting either bar be fully depleted before a recharge. I mentioned earlier that the game did something clever by having 2 separate stories going on simultaneously, and this is something that is down to the player's discretion to whether one is in fact present with the other. The game is drenched in metaphor, which makes you question the reality of what you are actually playing through. This starts off subtle with the use of seemingly mundane items presenting the objects of power, and slowly grows with the enormous amounts of literature you can pick up and read. Reading these are of course completely optional, but thankfully they are always short in length and relatively straight to the point, meaning that you never get bogged down reading page after page of diary entries, which breaks the flow. This is one of the game's strongest points. The main plot of the Bureau having been taken over by the Hiss and the convoluted mission objectives needed to progress through the game would have been enough to keep me hooked, as despite not really making any logical sense, Control's incredibly well realised world and characters makes it all seem necessary, but the secondary unravelling of what the A-plot might actually be representing is just as intriguing, but at a completely different level that runs at its own pace, but never becomes too distracting as to make you feel disconnected to everything else that is going on. But story isn't everything, and this is a third-person action game after all, so you won't be inclined to continue your adventure if killing enemies isn't enjoyable, which thankfully it consistently is. This comes down to a few things that Control manages to get spot on. Firstly is the level design and how enemies are placed. This is not a corridor shooter where you run and gun, often taking out one enemy at a time. Instead, every encounter will be against a sometimes randomly generated selection of enemies who inhabit a wide area, allowing for different levels of elevation, interactive objects, and multiple approaches and tactics. The second thing that Control gets right is simple combat mechanics which require complex thought. The opening hours of the game are expectedly paced to accommodate for your lack of weapons and powers, but as your arsenal grows and you gain more mods and unlocks, you'll be presented with enemies that require a more thoughtful approach to the large battle environments. This boils down to how you manage your ammo and power meter. Hurling a massive pipe at an exploding enemy will be an effective way to take them down, but will it leave you with enough resource to quickly dodge out of the way to avoid the impact? Armoured enemies take on a certain amount of punishment before you can inflict damage to their health bar, but there is only a short window of time before the armour replenishes, and if you spend all of your resource knocking it off, you're going to be left with little to blast them into the weird ethereal mist, or protect yourself from incoming attacks. You get into a pleasing rhythm of dodging, throwing, shooting and force pushing that requires your constant attention. Unlimited ammo and Jedi mind tricks doesn't mean this game is a breeze though. Enemies do a decent amount of damage to you, and getting swarmed unexpectedly is a quick way to an untimely end. One close blast from an explosive can shave off all but the last sliver of health, and if you didn't plan your attack patterns carefully to leave health pickups in your points of retreat, it's back to the control points for you. That brings me on to one of the things that some people might find bothersome, which is how far back you will sometimes need to start from in order to reach the point from which you failed. Regardless of how far you have explored, you will always pick up from the last control point that you interacted with. This isn't too much of an issue, as they are generally plentiful, but in the early game you won't have discovered enough of the map to find out where they all are, and if you weren't fully paying attention on how you got to a place or where you were, you might become frustrated on figuring out how to get back there. This isn't too much of an issue though, as the game has more than enough reasons to visit every area due to the countermeasures. Countermeasures are probably most reminiscent of daily unlocks from things like Destiny or PUBG, only here you can cycle through them until you find the ones that take your fancy. These are small combat tasks that you can set out to achieve in order to receive different types of mods, and these vary from things like killing a certain number of enemies with a certain weapon in a certain place to... well, that's it actually. These are completely optional, but act as a way to acquire mods at a predetermined level, and as mods can be broken down for in-game currency, it's a useful way to keep a cash flow going. Along with countermeasures, we also have missions. These are required by talking to NPCs, and you will usually have your main story mission along with one or two side quests which again are optional. They are worth doing however, as completing them will grant you ability points which can be spent on upgrading your powers and stats. Upgrading the strength of your launch attack early on is a godsend, and the option to upgrade your health and power meter isn't unwelcome either. There is nothing new here. Most every game these days has upgrade trees, multiple weapons, bonfire style checkpoints and materials to pick up. But what makes Control stand above the others, for me at least, is how it has a comparatively small set of all these mechanics. It's usually very easy to get bogged down in searching for collectibles, grinding for loot and trying to unlock every perk and weapon in a game, but Control has such a concise amount of all of these that fit in with the pace that there is just enough to unlock everything by the end of the game's running time without having to repeat any content or feel like you have missed anything out. Control achieves on its gameplay mechanics, which are by no means revolutionary, but here have been developed to a high competence standard. The main selling point to Control, and probably what will either make it or break it for you, is the atmosphere and design. I haven't mentioned the graphics to this point, and these range from not too bad to bloody fantastic. It's really more the design that's impressive. Not to say that the character models don't look great and the motion capture of Jessie wouldn't seem out of place in a AAA title, but the most memorable moments of Control are when it gets its weirdest. Let's take the moment for example where you have to free a guy from a containment cell who can't break eye contact with a fridge, because if he does, the fridge may go wild and kill everyone. That's pretty silly, but at no point did it feel silly when I was playing it, as I was fully going along with the world the game had built up until that point. Things get more bizarre when encountering the kitchen appliance has you fighting this massive thing, but it all feeds back into that secondary narrative of what does this actually all represent. The whole aesthetic of the game makes things that should be seen as normal seem more out of place than, say, I don't know, being able to fly. This put me particularly on edge when approaching this seamlessly normal bathroom duck.
Disappearing ducks. Great.
It sometimes feels as if you're on the opposite side of the fourth wall trying to break back in. To accompany you on decrypting the riddle, you'll find lots of video recordings that come in two flavours. The first are these live action science logs performed by Robin Hood Men in Tights' own Will Scarlet, and the second being these incredibly creepy puppet shows.
Hey, Meg! What's wrong?
My mom's dead.
I'm so sorry, Meg! What happened?
I don't know. They blacked it out.
Which reminded me of that episode of The Adventures of Mark Twain where they meet Satan. There is also quite an emphasis on music. You'll often find radios that play specific songs, and if you're studying the documents you find, they will have greater meaning. And then we have the motel. Scattered throughout the game, you'll find these reoccurring sections where you'll have to pull a light switch a few times to be transported to a mundane hallway. These small interludes help to break up the action and give a little more insight to the convoluted story. These sections are often overcome with completion of one of the game's few puzzles. Alongside a bit of thoughtful platforming, the main brain scratches you will come across in the game will form either launching power blocks into clearly marked sockets, or matching patterns on a screen to open a door. These I could take or leave, to be honest. They seem a little bit of an afterthought and don't really help to serve the game in any way, other than to slow the pace slightly. I think it's obvious at this point that I like the game. In fact, I can't think of an exclusively single player experience that I've played and enjoyed quite to the extent of this in maybe the last decade, possibly even more. I can't put my finger on any one thing that I think makes it stand out the most. The setting, characters, and the design of the game just happen to be exactly the kind of thing that appeal to me, but that won't be for everyone. You could argue that strip away all the magical elements, you're left with pretty bog standard enemy types fighting around environments that have been almost cliche in action games. But that statement falls down with how interactive everything is around you. Every environmental object in the game can be picked up and flung around. A perfectly laid out row of office desks and chairs will be nothing short of a bomb site after a battle has ensued, and it is clear that this was one of the main intentions of the game. Also, due to the fact that one of your primary attacks is picking up the scenery and throwing it around, even replaying failed battles multiple times over never feels repetitious. Moments in battle will happen that you won't be able to replicate. Maybe you caught a rocket mid-air just in time to fire it once and set off a chain reaction of explosions, and these moments are always rewarding. There is an enormous emphasis on spectacle that sadly not many games have anymore, brought on by the simple application of over-the-top physics and fantastic sound design. At times it reminded me of a mixture of the game's Fear and Half-Life, with obvious hints of Max Payne, least of which being the similarities between Jessie and Mona Sachs. But with all of that aside, it's the underlying intrigue which had me impatient to finish the story, while simultaneously not wanting it to be over. I think how you summarise the game is down to your own interpretation, but there is one almost throwaway line spoken by a character that could be easily missed that made everything just click and fall into place for me. I might be completely wrong, the game might not be deeper than the hiss or a bad force that need to be stopped, but coming from the guy who made the nightmare sections of Max Payne, where you run along stretched out tendons to the sound of your murdered baby, I think something a little bit closer to home is at play here.
In my dream, the hiss had broken free of this prison, this house. I'd set it free. And the president himself was there to welcome us. He was the first one to take the hiss in. Spread the word.
I've pretty much done nothing but praise Control, but to be honest, I can't really think of anything that I didn't love about it from start to finish. The combat was always a joy, exploring was always rewarding, upgrades and mods present themselves at a perfectly paced rate, and I don't think I'll ever get tired of hearing the mind control sound of something flying into my grasp. The worst thing about playing Control is the realisation that most companies just don't make games like this anymore. A completely uncompromised single-player only game with a setting and story that run the risk of alienating its audience by not fitting in with anything currently popular on the market. It's like it's a game made just for me, and because of that, I think it's kind of perfect. Even gameplay mechanics I generally don't like, such as fast travel, didn't pull me out of the experience, especially after the point two characters sit down and discuss how weird it is that you can fast travel and no one else can. I don't think it's for everyone. I think if you don't like a fractured narrative, undisciplined combat, and a protagonist who acts far from natural to the weird nonsense going on, you're probably not going to find much fun in it. But if that is your bag, then I strongly encourage you to give Control your time of day.
Looks safe to me. Dockers and space! Wait! It's not even plugged in!